I'm Dan Rather in New York with Vicki Mabry near Waco with an update on the 51-day standoff outside Waco, Texas. Early this morning, armored vehicles entered cult leader David Koresh's compound and began punching large holes in the wall.
And good evening, friends. Right now, we just don't know. Despite his pledge to surrender over 7 hours ago, still no break reported tonight outside of Waco. Cult leader David Koresh apparently remains holed up in his heavily armed fortress, and we assume that negotiations with law officers continue.
I must tell you, this is a horrible sight from 2 miles away. This is really a horrible sight.
As David Koresh and his followers continue to stall and continue to put them off. Finally, sources tell us over the weekend, Attorney General Janet Reno agreed that firing tear gas in there in non-lethal doses that would still be safe for the children inside.
The promise was eternal life.
What about these people here?
Well, those people here are people, well, you know what they think of me? They think I'm the Son of God. Yeah. Is he the Son of God?
I will declare and decree, the Lord has said unto me, thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee. Come on, the Son of God.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. My name is Don Van Zant, and this is the Lost Mission Podcast, where our goal is to help us as believers get back to our mission of knowing and sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us today. This is our series on cults and fringe groups. And if you've been watching the videos, you know why we make the distinction between cults and fringe groups is because there seems to be a little bit of a division there between groups that may be what we would usually consider to be a cult and those who may not be a cult, but they may not at the same time be strictly orthodox. We're considering those groups to be fringe groups. But our definition that we are using of a cult comes from the Kingdom of the Cults, and they are defined by Dr. Walter Martin as any religious group which differs significantly in one or more respects as to belief or practice from those religious groups which are regarded as the normative expressions of religion in our total culture. And we are simplifying that definition down a little bit to say that a cult is a group that exists far beyond the bounds of orthodoxy. And a fringe group is one that, while not strictly orthodox, isn't quite as far out as what we would consider a cult to be. For example, we just finished a series on the Seventh Day Adventist. I do not believe they're a cult. I would consider them to be a fringe group. However, today's group is undoubtedly, I don't see how we could define them as or view them as anything other than a religious cult. Who are we talking about? The group that we're discussing today are the Branch Davidians and David Koresh in Waco, Texas. But before we get into the video, if you like this channel, if you like this content, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It's a small thing, but it really helps the show out a lot. So hit that like button, subscribe, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Okay, the Branch Davidians. Who are the Branch Davidians? We think of the Branch Davidians, and immediately they are associated with David Koresh. And if you're anything like me, then you likely believed for a long time that David Koresh started the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. But if you're anything like me, you were wrong to think that. The Branch Davidians are a sect of the Seventh Day Adventists. They are still active to this very day. They're still around. They still exist. Despite everything that happened in Waco in 1993, the Branch Davidians are still active. They are still around. They're still in operation to this very day. But who are they? The group was founded in 1943 by Bulgarian immigrant and Maytag washer salesman turned modern-day prophet Elijah, Victor Hautef. Victor Hautef had become somewhat sort of upset with, maybe disenfranchised with traditional Seventh-day Adventism, feeling as though the group had become too worldly and it was not focused on what he believed to be the imminent return of Jesus Christ. And so as Victor Hautef began to watch the Seventh-day Adventists, he became increasingly, in his mind, aware that they weren't focused on what they were supposed to be focused on. They were Seventh-day Adventists. They were to be looking for the advent of Jesus Christ. But he felt as though that they weren't doing this just right. So what he does, he becomes so upset by this, he writes a series of tracts entitled The Shepherd's Rod, and began forming a group by the same name, The Shepherd's Rod. And later, he would come to believe, he would kind of venture pretty far off. He would come to believe that he himself was the modern-day prophet Elijah, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church were the prophets of Baal. And so he felt that since he was Elijah, they were the prophets of Baal, that there was going to be a showdown between the prophet of God and the prophets of Baal. And he believed this would occur at his compound, which he took to naming, if you know anything about Branch Davidians, you guessed it, Mount Carmel. Over time, numbers began to grow, and Hautef found himself with a following of about 100 devoted followers. Not a large group, but not a small group either. About 100 devotees began to follow Victor Hautef to Mount Carmel, where they believed there would be this showdown between the SDA and between Victor Hautef. The community was a small, self-enclosed sort of miniature society with its own school and communal kitchen, but with deliberately primitive living conditions. It was sort of just a collection of cheaply built clapboard cottages. The life was designed to test its members. They had this goal in mind. They weren't trying to be modern. They were wanting to be tested, to discover whether they were willing to suffer the hardships of the withering experience, the conquest of the flesh in the name of the Spirit, to prove that they were the servants of God and not the servants of Baal. That's taken from David Thibodeau's book on Waco, where he describes who the early Branch Davidians were. So as time would go on, things would begin to change. Victor Hautef began to age, and in 1955, Hautef died, leaving behind his group and his wife to sort of run the group. So in 1955, Hautef dies. His widow, Florence Hautef, takes over leadership duties of the group. And Mrs. Hautef carries on the legacy of her husband with the communal living, with the coming together, with the sort of living off of the land and testing the members to see if they were going to be worthy. And of course, with this eager anticipation of Christ's return. They have outlived their prophet Elijah, but they still believe that Jesus is going to come back. And let me just pause there and say there's no problem at all with a group to say that we are looking for the imminent return of Christ. That doesn't make them a cult to say that we believe Jesus is coming back soon. As a matter of fact, it's biblical to look for the blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ. So when you hear of a group that says, oh, we're looking for the return of Christ, don't immediately write that group off and say, oh, well, they're a cult. Any Christian ought to be looking for the return of Jesus. But Mrs. Hautef was eager for the return of Christ. Maybe just a bit too eager. She began teaching that to her followers, that Christ would return and a new messianic age would begin on April 22nd, 1959. Hautef dies in 1955. Florence Hautef takes the group over, and by 1959, she's telling them Jesus is going to come back in the spring, April 22nd. And as with literally every prophecy of the dated return of Christ that has ever been given to this very point, every one has been proven false. Florence Hautef was no different. Her April 22nd, 1959 prediction of the return of Christ became a failed prophecy Because here we are now in 2021. Cries still hasn't returned. So when this happened, as with these groups and the way things go, this becomes a pattern with group after group after group. There's disappointment within the group, within the shepherd's rod. And they begin to splinter. They begin to break off into several smaller factions. And mind you, they only have about 100 or so followers. So the 100 followers are now splintered and broken off into even smaller groups. And among these factions was a group led by a man by the name of Ben Roden. And what Ben Roden did is he wanted to sort of succeed Howtef. He didn't like what had happened after the death of Howtef, the way that Florence had kind of just gone off the rails and made her prediction. Howtef saw this as a grave error and a misstep and a lack of judgment. And so here's what Ben Roden said. Ben Roden tells his followers that they needed to, quote, get off the dead rod, led by Florence Howtef, and move to the living branch. The Roden family, Ben, his wife Lois, and his son George, would then lead the cult on for the next several years. And thus, from this point, they began to be referred to as the Branch Davidians, that they needed to get off the old broken rod and back onto the branch. And they settled in on Mount Carmel. So, but what was Mount Carmel? Mount Carmel is in the story of the Branch Davidians. It's almost a character in and of itself. Because as much as you see the face of David Koresh and the sort of sinister element that is associated with Koresh, the compound is just as much a part of this story, Mount Carmel, where the Branch Davidians would sit on. If you've seen any older footage, you have seen the compound on fire. You have seen ATF or FBI agents storming into the compound. You may have even seen footage or imagery or videos or photography that shows the compound before it was destroyed. It's very much a player in the story. But what was it? So Mount Carmel was never really much to speak of. It was somewhat of a humble place, very quaint, very nice at a particular point in time. But it was just a dusty old flat patch of land down an old country Texas road. I've actually been to and visited the Waco compound after the siege of 1993. A few years ago, my family and I traveled there, and we got to go down that old country road and go down the long driveway and see what it is. And it's not much to look at now, and really never was. So the early days of Victor Howtef showed some promise, as the, at that time, 189-acre tract of land provided access to the river, provided plenty of trees, and a large clearing where a church and several structures were built. And it did have some charm. It had some character to it. One of the most striking features of the compound was something that was referred to as the 11th hour clock. It was situated inside the compound's main building. This clock was designed to predict the second coming of Jesus. Obviously, Florence Howtef would get this wrong, but they had this clock that was pointing toward the return of Christ. In modern days, nowadays, the clock is owned by a private school in Texas, where it's since been refurbished, and it sits as a sort of piece of art history. There's really no religious or spiritual significance to the clock now, but in its day, during its time, it was very important to the Branch Davidians, and it was situated inside the compound. So there was also a large dome-shaped feed barn and windmill that just seemed to sort of sum up the rural, self-sufficient, off-the-grid, farm and ranch feel and style aesthetic that the Branch Davidians were going for. It was a nice little place, but it just wasn't much to speak of. And as time wore on, Mount Carmel became a mess of old structures in need of repair. It seemed as though Mrs. Roden, after Ben Roden passed away, Mrs. Roden just wasn't able to keep up with Mount Carmel and began to fall in disarray. She wasn't capable of running the property, and her son George wasn't much better. So new leadership was needed, and needed badly. And this carries on through the 70s. And really, that's what brings us to our main character of our story. In the summer of 1981, a flashy little yellow Buick came bouncing down the driveway of Mount Carmel, and out stepped a tall, skinny, scruffy young man, full of life and full of charisma This recent convert to Seventh Day Adventism had heard so much about Mount Carmel that he just had to come down and see what this place was really all about. This energetic, maybe even a little bit cocky young rock star was a young man by the name of Vernon Wayne Howell, who would later become known as David Koresh. Very quickly after arriving at Mount Carmel, David strikes up a sort of a romance with the widow Roden. At this point, Lois Roden is in her 60s, David in his early 20s. They're an odd couple, to say the least. And it just didn't seem to set right with a lot of people. Most notably, Lois's son, George. He was no fan of the relationship, and he was no fan of David. But in David's mind, young David, who was always so focused on the Word of God, which I've heard that he actually memorized, I've heard the entire Bible at a very young age. I don't know, but David certainly had a fixation on the Scriptures and on the Old Testament and on the patriarchs, Abraham, and on the prophets, Ezekiel. And David began to believe of himself that he was going to form a sort of relationship with Lois Roden in which he would be the Abraham and she would be the aged and the older Sarah. And so, to that end, George's frustrations with David, they seem almost justified. Here's this younger man, possibly younger than George, comes in and strikes up a romance with his mother, believes he's going to father a child with Lois, who is in her 60s. She is past the time of having children, but David believes that God supernaturally is going to allow her to conceive, and they're going to have a son. And George wants no part of this. He thinks David is a charlatan. He thinks David is a shyster. He thinks he's only there so that he can take the group away from the Roden family, and so that he can take over Mount Carmel. And as time went on, the power dynamic began to shift. It went away from the Rodens, and David did arise as the clear-cut leader of the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians did not receive their name from David Koresh. They received their name from the biblical King David. The Branch Davidians were not named after David Koresh. But David rises up, becomes the leader of the Branch Davidians, and this move causes much division. And at this point, George Roden's done. He won't have it. He won't hear it. He wants nothing more to do with David and his shenanigans. He wants David gone. So David, in his usual sort of passive-aggressive way, David leaves. He splits. He literally splits. He takes his group to another location, which is the majority of the Branch Davidians at this point. I believe they go and they reside in Palestine, Texas, which isn't too far from Waco. I want to say maybe 100 miles. Feel free to fact check me on that and see. But he goes to a place that if Mount Carmel was beginning to fall into disarray, David almost moves his people into a dump. Place where the shelter is poor, there's no running water, they're living under dire conditions, but they go and they move away and let George Roden have the now empty Mount Carmel. And it was during this time that David actually marries his first wife. Understand, David was a polygamist. David had multiple wives. He made no effort to try and hide that. But the problem is this. David didn't just marry grown women. David's first legal wife was 14-year-old Rachel Jones. Yes, 14-year-old Rachel Jones. If you've seen the miniseries about Waco, you've seen David as he takes this young wife, Rachel Jones. She becomes Rachel Koresh. And in the series, she's played by actress Melissa Benoist. And that is so interesting to me because literally, David marries Supergirl. So what happens is after David marries his child bride and they move away from Mount Carmel, a sort of showdown takes place between the two prophets, quote, prophets of God. You have George Roden on the one hand, who is still camped out at Mount Carmel. You have David and the Branch Davidians on the other hand that are trying to get away from or to wait out George Roden. So as time went on, George Roden became increasingly sort of erratic, declaring holy war on David, conducting videotaped interviews where he goes around sporting an M1 rifle and saying that he and Koresh were in a sort of jihad-style battle. And this all comes to a boiling point around 1986 or 1987. The dates are a bit unclear as to when it happens, but it's just a few years after David actually arrives at Mount Carmel, 5, maybe 6 years. And what he does, he challenges David to a battle of the prophets. And would you know that David Koresh, is actually the one that is sane in this story. David is the one who acts properly. George Roden is the one who acts crazy. Here's what happened. George Roden dug up the body of a deceased cult member and told David that whichever prophet could resurrect the body would be declared the winner and would receive Mount Carmel as sort of the prize for the showdown between the prophets, and they would gain full access to the cult. You know, just an average, everyday land battle that is settled by a resurrection. You know, happens all the time, right? And I love David's response, because as I've studied David, this is David Koresh. In such a subtle tone, he looks at George and he says, "Not today, George." And that's it. He won't even feed into the hype that George is trying to build. David wants no part of it, just not today. But David does do this. David actually goes and reports Roden to the local sheriff. But then, for some reason that I still don't fully understand, David and his group go and they take matters into their own hands. They did the right thing by reporting this illegal exhumation of a corpse by George Roden to the authorities. But rather than waiting on the authorities to go and do their job, David decides to make his own private raid on Mount Carmel in the middle of the night. Here's what he does. This is from a New York Times article on the shootout with George Roden. On the morning of November 3rd, 1987, he and 7 of his followers, dressed in camouflage uniforms and combat boots, with charcoal smeared under their eyes and armed with military-style rifles and shotguns, crawled onto the sect's property east of here. Their objective seemed to be to retake the land that Mr. Koresh had left 3 years earlier in a dispute with the sect's leader. Although Mr. Koresh and the others said they were trying to uncover evidence of illegal activity by the leader, there was an exchange of gunfire that lasted for several minutes and left the leader, George Roden, slightly wounded, and Mr. Koresh ultimately in control of the property and the sect. But after a 2-week trial here, none of the participants were convicted of anything, and their weapons were returned to them. So this settled the issue. From this point on, David is firmly planted as the leader of the Branch Davidians. He is firmly planted as the sort of owner of Mount Carmel. Now, several of the Branch Davidians were arrested in connection with this raid. David himself is actually charged with attempted murder. However, his charges are dropped and is declared a mistrial because of some lack of evidence, and David is set free. He does go to trial, but it's considered to be a mistrial, and David is set free and becomes the leader of the Branch Davidians and is firmly planted into Mount Carmel. But what about the siege of Mount Carmel? This is the most famous element of the story. Much of what David had done to this point seems to be a foreshadowing of what was to come. His skinny frame and charismatic personality would help him to grow his following. David was a likable guy. His strange relationship with Lois Roden would evolve into more strange relationships with multiple women and underage girls, and would lead to him marrying multiple wives. The theology that he learned from Lois Roden would be a definite influence on him later in life, as he became the prophet to the people. But the guns were the final straw for David. It was his love for firearms that would ultimately sort of do him in. And I know there is much speculation surrounding the weapons, and that's where most of the conversation seems to begin to lie. But it's at this point that I want to stress and emphasize that the intent of the remainder of this episode and of this podcast is not political. My goal here is not to delve or dive or go deeply down into the conversation surrounding the ATF or the FBI and David and the possibility of the illegal possession of, manufacture of firearms. That's not the intent of this discussion. The rest of this discussion is not intended to out David as a right-wing extremist, nor is it to expose the FBI and ATF as baby killers that preyed on the innocents within the group. That is not my goal. Look, there's plenty of political commentary out there on that side of the discussion. I'll let you do your own research and draw your own conclusions from there. I want to stay as neutral as possible with this conversation. I understand it's very emotionally charged and people find themselves invested into it, and I just really don't care to do that with you guys. My goal is to tell a story, not give a commentary. In this episode, my goal is to tell a story. As time went on, David became increasingly paranoid, as his visions and sermons became increasingly apocalyptic. In late 1992, David warned some of his followers of the possibility of government overthrow within the group. In a conversation with some of his followers, David posed this question. He asked this. This is in late 1992. What are you going to do 6 months from now when this is all surrounded with tanks? And such an eerie foreshadowing of what would actually happen. And the group brushed the hypothetical question off as an over-exaggeration by their leader. But this all changed later on in 1992, when in August of that year, the FBI and ATF raided the Ruby Ridge compound and killed several members of Randy Weaver's family. Their focus began to change. They began to think maybe David's onto something. Maybe he's not nutty. Maybe he's not lost it. Because of what happened on Ruby Ridge, they began to stand up and take notice of what David had been telling them, that what are you going to do when they come to our place? Now, for me, I was just a kid when this all happened. I was 7 or 8 years old when the siege happened at Waco. I don't really remember much of what happened at Ruby Ridge at all. I remember hearing about it, but I don't actually remember the event. But I do remember the 90s, and I remember them as being a time that was marked by a spike in a lack of trust for the government and a distrust in our political leadership. I remember the rise of various militia groups led by the likes of Mark Kornke and others. I remember the discussion surrounding Oklahoma City in 1995. So much was going on. It was a very anti-government decade, if I can put it that way. I remember so much of what happened, and I could do an entire episode, an entire podcast on my own experiences and what I saw happen in the 90s, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. It's one of the biggest you had to be there moments of the 90s, the Waco siege of 1993. So what happens? February 28th, 1993. The siege begins. The 51-day siege starts. February 28th, 1993. From the U.S. Department of Justice Archives. On the morning of Sunday, February 28th, 1993, agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, attempted to serve an arrest warrant for Vernon Howell, a.k.a. David Koresh, and a search warrant at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas. The arrest warrant charged Koresh with unlawful possession of a destructive device in violation of 26 United States codes, section 5845F. Both the search warrant and the arrest warrant were signed by a United States magistrate judge. The search warrant authorized the search of the premises of the 77-acre compound located at Route 7, Box 47B, a.k.a. the Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas, for evidence relating to the unlawful possession of fully automatic machine guns and destructive devices. While attempting to serve these warrants, ATF agents came under heavy gunfire from individuals in the compound. As a result, 4 ATF agents were killed and 15 wounded. It was believed that Branch Davidians had purchased in the 17 or so months prior to the siege, that they had purchased in the neighborhood of $100,000 to possibly $200,000 worth of guns and ammunition, and that they were really gearing up for something. And so the ATF came to arrest David and came to execute a search warrant. And the search warrant would have either verified or falsified the report of the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of guns that were on Mount Carmel's property. It's also worth noting that many illegal firearms, Kevlar helmets, mills, lathes, and other machinery used to manufacture or modify firearms were found in the wreckage after the siege was over. So there was evidence of at least something being there. And that's all I'm going to comment on that portion of what actually happened with the guns. But in addition to 4 ATF agents, 6 Davidians were also killed, and David suffered a gunshot wound to the torso. So the raid did not go as planned. The radio call signal Showtime was used to signal ATF agents out of the cattle trailers to begin the raid. And that was either on the February 28th or the April 19th, but at some point the call signal Showtime was used. I'm just not certain as to which day it was actually used. The Davidians were tipped off prior to the beginning of the raid, and so both sides were prepared. Were there errors in judgment on the ATF's side? Absolutely. Were there errors in judgments on the Davidian side? Absolutely. At the end of the failed raid, the FBI set up camp near the compound's entrance, while David and his group of devotees settled inside the compound. And the situation just seemed poised to explode again at any moment. There's so much stress on both sides between the ATF and their agents and David and his followers on the inside. Neither group is willing to give. Neither group is willing to budge. And it seems like at any time, this thing's just going to explode again. Tragedy appeared inevitable. So the FBI settled in with lead negotiator Gary Nesner and chief negotiator Byron Sage. They were the top 2 main guys over the 51 days. There were some 23 negotiators used throughout the process of time, but Nesner and Sage were the top 2 guys. And as negotiations began, the plea was again and again for David to lead his people out. David, lead your people out of here. Come out, surrender. Time and again, they reached out to David. And time and again, David refused, said he would not come out. But it is worth noting that this situation was not, and as far as I know, never has been considered a hostage situation. David let his people know, let his followers know, let Steve Schneider know, he let David Thibodeau know, he let his family know, if you want to go, you can go. You can leave. It was never considered a hostage situation. Even the FBI negotiators, I believe Byron Sage has come out and said this was not a hostage situation. And over the course of the 51-day siege, some 35 people, 21 of which were children, were able to leave the compound. So there was some good news as negotiators would plead and more people would come out. So here's the issue. Here's the thing. While it was not strictly a hostage situation, there were children in the building. These children had no opportunity to leave. They were completely dependent upon the decision of their parents. So were the kids hostages? It's hard to say. They were following their parents. Were their parents hostages? No. No, they were not. But these poor children were just there, and they were along for the ride. And that's the heartbreaking part of the whole story, is the kids. It's this part of the story that troubles me. It's this part of the story that angers me. David Koresh could have let his people go. He should have told his people, take your kids, get them to safety, get out of here. That's what a wise man does. That's what a good leader does. But David chose not to do that. But let's see what happened. March the 1st, 1993, David settles in and prepares for a fight. Wounded and bleeding, he demands communications be restored. And after the FBI had cut the phone lines, and he demands that he is given a national platform for his message. So the FBI agrees and secures David a place on the local Waco affiliate of the Christian Broadcasting Network, the CBN. However, the women that David sends out to deliver his audio, his cassette tape, they're quickly arrested, and upon learning of their poor treatment, David is enraged. All still seems to be set for the exit. They're going to come out March 1st, 1993, until David hears of how they treated his followers that came out. And the group's prepared. They're getting their bags ready. They're getting their clothes ready. They're set to go until late that afternoon when David claims to hear from God, and God tells David to stay. All plans are halted, and the siege continues. March 5th, 1993. The last of the 21 children leave the compound. The rest will die with David. March 9th, 1993. After the FBI cuts off the electricity, the Davidians hang a handmade banner out of an upper story window that states, "God help us, we need the press." March 21st, 1993. 7 more adults leave the compound, and this seems to be a positive move. But tensions rise on the FBI side. The FBI can't seem to get it together. Negotiators are working with David, and slowly people are coming out. But the other agents that aren't a part of the negotiation team, they're gung-ho. They're ready to go. And tensions rise within the FBI itself. Some continue to push toward a peaceful resolution, while other agents resort to such tactics as cutting off the water and power supply, blasting bright lights into windows at night, playing wailing bagpipes, dying rabbits, screaming baby sounds, and off-the-hook telephone sounds. At one point, they even set up a loudspeaker and they played "These Boots Were Made for Walking" by Nancy Sinatra. But David, not to be outdone, he sets up his own sound system, and either through the electricity supplied by the FBI or an external generator, somehow David gets his own power, and he plays his own rock concert back. Remember, David is a man that loves music, and he has his own band, and so they fire back their own tunes, and they have sort of a battle of the bands right there in the middle of the siege. It was all very dramatic, because sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction. March 23rd, 1993. Livingston Fagan is the last adult to surrender. April 7th to the 14th, 1993, the Davidians celebrate Passover. And for this group, this would be the last of the happy days. This final week was the last time they would all be together, happy, enjoying one another's company, enjoying the celebration of their religious feast. It was during this time that the FBI also began finalizing its plan for a tear gas assault on the Davidians. And it was also during this time that David began sending out handwritten correspondence not signed as Vernon Howell or not signed as David Koresh, but actually he began signing it as Yahweh Koresh, almost indicating that David is viewing himself in a divine sense at this point, that he may very well be God. April 19th, 1993, the fateful day. At 5:50 a.m., the FBI calls to inform the group to take cover because the tear gas attack is imminent. Steve Schneider, one of David's right-hand men, becomes so enraged at this call that he actually rips the phone from the wall and throws it out the window. At 6:02 a.m., 2 FBI agents break through the walls and begin inserting tear gas into the walls of the compound. Some reports say surveillance devices pick up chatter from the Davidians about possibly spreading fuel and starting fires within the compound, and this is still unclear whether this is true or not. This is one of those murky details within the story that really could hinge our view as to whether we believe the Davidians did it or whether the FBI started the fires. We still don't know, but there are reports of them possibly spreading a fuel and possibly starting a fire that was picked up by surveillance equipment within the compound. I'll let you draw your own conclusions to that. 6:31 a.m., the entire building is gassed, and surveillance recordings tell of cries of, "They're going to kill us," and "They don't want to kill us." Conflicting perspectives abound. At some point, Byron Sage reaches over in a near ceremonious way and turns off the communications device with the Davidians. He knows that there's no more two-way communication that's going to occur. It's over. The fate of the Branch Davidians and David Koresh are now in the hands of God. As the morning wears on and the bullets begin to fly, naturally the bodies begin to pile up. Through the flames and through the bullets, so much happens. I'm going to share with you a few stories from David Thibodeau's book on Waco, and they're a bit graphic. If you have children, I might suggest turning the volume down or maybe sending them out of the room because some of what I'm about to tell us is a bit graphic. I just want to give that disclaimer. But here are some of the stories. I learned about how Winston Blank had died, a big man in his late 20s, a baker by trade. Winston, whose family came from the Caribbean, hated the cold. That damp, chilly morning, he had been wearing a couple of sweaters, 3 pairs of pants, and one of our David Koresh God Rocks t-shirts, and a black ammo vest with the Koresh Survival Wear logo. Apparently, he was just sitting on his bunk, eating a breakfast of French toast, when the bullets crashed through the water tanks outside of his window. One of them hit him under his right ear, and he fell forward into the water from the ruptured tanks, puddling on the floor, lying in a pool of water and blood, as I'd seen him. Jadine Wendell, our 5th fatality, had responded to the ATF assault with all of the instincts of the police officer she'd been once in her native Hawaii. When the firing started, Jadine had just finished breastfeeding her 10-month-old baby, Patron. Seizing a rifle, she ran on to her second-floor room, climbed onto a bunk bed, and returned the raiders' fire. After the ceasefire, Marjorie Thomas, who'd been caring for some of Jadine's children, found her sprawled on the bunk, a bullet in her skull. And of course, the story of David Koresh. Details still seem a bit unclear as to what exactly happened and what David's final moments were, but here's the story from David Thibodeau. To our amazement, however, David miraculously recovered. This is speaking of his gunshot wound. David miraculously recovered. We thought his wound was fatal, but an hour or so later, he sat proudly showing off the ugly gash in his side, asking for his guitar. "They don't kill me that easy," he whispered to me, winking. He even felt chipper enough to call his mother, Bonnie Haldeman, and leave a cheery, tragic message on her answering machine. "Hello, Mama. It's your boy. They shot me and I'm dying, all right? But I'll be back real soon, okay? I'm sorry you didn't learn the seals, but I'll be merciful, okay? I'll see y'all in the skies." Much death, much carnage that day. But according to an April 20th, 1993 article from the Waco Tribune, these were the final moments. 12:10 p.m., flames and smoke are seen pouring from the compound. 12:30 p.m., part of the roof collapses. 12:38 p.m., fire trucks arrive at the compound. And by 3:30 p.m., FBI says 9 people escaped the compound. The others, including as many as 24 children, presumably died in the blaze. At the end of the day, some 76 people were dead, including the 20-plus children. But what's the conclusion of all this? What should be our takeaway from this tragic and this sad tale, of this sad, sad story, of this undoubtedly not anti-Christian, but Christian cult. What should we think? The conclusion of this cult seems to be the end result of undue influence by one man over many people. It does not appear as though they wanted a fight. I don't think that David Koresh wanted to go to war. Were they 100% in the right? Like I said, no. Was the FBI and the ATF 100% in the right? Likely no. It's just a sad story. One that has its roots in a bizarre, apocalyptic, cultish story and group, and a sect of this group that took their bizarre views to a dangerous and a deadly end. You may have heard this expression that bad theology hurts people, or that bad theology kills. In this story, this is played out in the most literal sense, in the most literal form. We haven't gotten into their theology. That's for another episode. But know that this was a theologically based war. Bad theology really hurts people. That's why it's important, imperative, to rightly divide the word of truth. We should listen to the Word of God, the Bible. We should listen to church history. We should pay attention to things like proper hermeneutics. All of these things matter so much. And so, guys, here's my encouragement to you, the listener, to you, the viewer. Read your Bible. Steer clear of the cults. Focus on the truth of the Word of God. If what you read seems to be a bit odd or a bit off, run away from it. Get away from it. Go back to the truth of the matter. Don't be so convinced that only you and your group are right and that everybody else is wrong. Because if that's the case, likely you're the one that's wrong. But we're going to get more into some of the discussion surrounding David and his teachings in a later episode. But that's going to do it for this one, guys. As always, grace, peace. I'll catch you next time.